evening and welcome to the event Room, Make or Take on the Politics and Poetry of Space. My name is Lara Gross and I work at the Literary Colloquium Berlin. For those of you who joined this live stream from abroad and haven't had a chance to pay us a visit, the LCB is a venue for different kinds of events, mainly readings, book launches, and open air festivals, but it's also a place for workshops and it's a guest house. That means the LCB is not just an event forum, it's not just about the end product, so to say, it's also about the process, the whole making of a book, and about supporting this process in its entirety by offering conferences, workshops, and guest rooms to authors and translators. We usually welcome up to 70 authors per year in our guest house. However, the past 2 years have pushed and also inspired us to develop new digital formats for our residency programs. This event here is part of our second digital residency. It is the closing event after 2 months of exchange, discussion, and writing. The residency has been curated by Priya Basil. Together with Priya, we have invited 4 amazing authors: Billy Ray Belcourt, Basu Intan, Paramaditha, Adania, Shibli. Thank you all so much for taking part in this project, for exploring the realm of web residencies with us, and for contributing such rich and inspiring essays to the residency. I'm very excited to see where tonight's discussion will take us. Speaking of the texts, the authors' contributions to the digital residency are published in German and in English by Berlin independent publishing house Microtext. If you would like to get a copy or download the ebook, please visit www.microtext.com. Special thanks go to Nicola Richter, the head of Microtext, for featuring these authors in her program. This leads me to the next topic. We could only publish those texts with the help of a group of translators that did an excellent job translating the text from Indonesian, Arabic, and English to German and English. Thank you, Stephen Epstein, Adam Talib, Beatrice Fassbender, Eva Bonnet, Gudrun Igratubun, Irina Bondas, and Günther Ort. I also want to take this opportunity to thank the Ministry of Foreign Affairs for supporting this project and for encouraging us to establish new types of residencies. And of course, Priya, thank you so much for your dedication and your contribution to this project. Working with you has been a truly amazing and very inspiring experience. Priya Basil grew up in Kenya, studied in Britain, and came to live in Berlin in 2002. She has written 5 books so far. The 2 most recent ones on hospitality and feminism are very powerful blends of the political and the personal. Alongside her writing, Priya has been engaged with various political initiatives. She co-funded the platform Authors for Peace and the NGO Wir machen das. She initiated a campaign for a European public holiday, and she sits on the advisory board of the European Center for Constitutional and Human Rights. I can also highly recommend Priya's film essay, Locked In and Out, where she explores questions around citizenship, coloniality, and memory culture. It was first featured in December 2020 at the digital opening of the Humboldt Forum here in Berlin, but it's now available on YouTube as well, so go check it out. At the moment, Priya is the first writer in residence at Mindscape, which is an international cultural program that aims to support transformation in how we understand, address, and talk about mental health. Priya, once again, I am very, very happy you accepted our invitation, and I will now hand over to you. I wish all of you in the audience a great evening, and thank you.
Thank you so much, Lara, for this very generous introduction. And you catch something of the spirit that was created in the course of this residency. It was actually a gift to be invited to curate such a project, because in these times of sort of limited mobility for many of us because of the pandemic, I think the possibility to reach out quite as widely as we did was really fabulous. And at the moment, we are spanning time zones from Vancouver to Sydney. One of our authors who's in Ethiopia is not with us in the call, but present in other ways. And then Berlin and Bern. So this was actually the one time which we could all somehow be at a time that was bearable. So it's 7 a.m. in Sydney, 12 in Vancouver, 11 p.m. in Ethiopia, 9 p.m. in Central Europe. And this it's wonderfully affirming to feel the generosity of the writers who joined us, and their flexibility, the willingness to explore together. And this idea of room is really evocative. It's so capacious. That was what attracted me to it. Also, that so many things can sit within this notion of room. And I think the texts that the writers have written really affirm it's the very broad nature of this term and how many different ways in which it can be conceived. I'm really grateful to the writers for joining us, and to the three who are with me this evening, Intan, Billy Ray, and Adenia. Thank you so much for joining in this sort of experiment. I think digital residencies are not such a developed format. And the LCB, it's a villa on the Wannsee in Berlin. It's this kind of really impressive and warm place where you come and you meet, and there's a lot of conviviality. And this question of how we might recreate some of that online was a bit of a challenge. I must thank Lara Gross in return also for her support and generosity. And she connected us physically by sending packages to everybody in different countries, self-baked goods, books of the writers, and gave us this chance to have a little bit of a physical sense of each other. But I think what we have discovered in the course of conversations, we met a couple of times online, is that what most animates and connects us is literature, language, writing, words. And the writers, the four of them, I think they all share a particular sensibility, certain concerns, certain ways of looking at the world. And in this sense, room was a very fitting topic to invite them to join in, because they are concerned with instabilities, uncertainties of various kind. They're sort of drawn, I think, to unstable ground. And that's reflected not just in the text that they created for the anthology, and how wonderful it is also to have an anthology after just 2 months of knowing each other, to have this book, this space in which somehow we will always be united, is also a very beautiful thing. Also in their other writing, all four writers, I think, are concerned with and interested in what happens when you move or change place or point of view, and the risk that that involves. At the beginning of Intan Paramaditha's novel, The Wandering, her character reflects, if you want to go home, you lose everything. Your home will not be what it was. There will no longer be a place for you here. This is a kind of challenge that the main character accepts in her restlessness. It's a risk she's willing to take. In one of his essays, In a History of My Brief Body, Billy Ray Belcourt reflects, so many world-shattering things can happen in the schism between an event and our ability to comprehend it. I pitch a tent there. And in her novel, Minor Detail, Adania Shibli's narrator finds herself trespassing her own land, her own history. And she thinks, well, no going back now, not after crossing so many borders, military ones, geographical ones, physical ones, psychological ones, mental ones. And so I think this idea of space and how we inhabit it, and how differently we experience the world, and really unites all these writers. I will just briefly introduce them a bit more fully for those of you who may not already know their work. I think Adeniya has lost her connection, but she'll be back. I will start with Billy Ray, who's a writer and academic from the Driftpile Cree Nation, and he's an assistant professor of Indigenous creative writing at the University of British Columbia. His debut book of poems was This Wound is a World, and his second book was NDN Coping Mechanisms, Notes from the Field. Both were critically acclaimed, won multiple awards in Canada, and his most recent book, which I mentioned and Lara mentioned, A History of My Brief Body, is a collection of essays on grief, colonial violence, joy, love, and queerness. Intan Paramaditha is a writer and academic. She writes in the Indonesian language and is the author of a short story collection, Apple and Knife, and the novel The Wandering. Her books have also been critically acclaimed and won prizes in Australia and Indonesia, and as well as an English Pen Translation Award and Penheim Translation Fund grant. She holds a PhD from New York University and teaches media and film studies at Macquarie University in Sydney. Adeniya Shibli, born in Palestine in 1974, has written novels, plays, short stories, and essays. She's received also various awards, and her novel Minor Detail was shortlisted for the National Book Award in 2020 in America and nominated for the International Booker Prize this year. Since 2012, Adeniya has been teaching at Belcourt University in Palestine, and right now she's at the University of Bern in Switzerland, where for the winter semester she was Friedrich Dürrenmatt Guest Professor for World Literature. The one writer who's not with us this evening, Besu Fakad, is an Ethiopian writer living in Addis Ababa. In the contribution for this anthology, written on the 21st of November 2021, while the war in Ethiopia was nearing Addis Ababa, Besu Fakad struggles to make complete sense of what is happening, but only finds and offers a few lines that might help to keep going. Besu Fakad decided to use a pseudonym in order to avoid the political polarization that exists between leaders and public figures representing different groups of Ethiopians. We're really glad that we could have this text in our anthology and that we had the chance to exchange with Besu, as we now call the person, before this event as well, so that they are with us in different ways and through the text, which we hope that you will also read and appreciate. I would like to begin by asking each of you how you conceive, what this notion room means for you, how it resonates with you, just in a very general sense. I wonder, Intan, if you would like to begin.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Priya, for curating this wonderful project. I think the digital residency really helped me to think about my own work and to engage with others' works as well. So thank you so much. And I would like to thank LCB and especially Lara for facilitating us. I would like to start by acknowledging that I am living in Sydney, Australia, and we know that Australia was and will always be Aboriginal land. So I acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which I work and live, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respect to elders past, present, and emerging. So I think room, I'm interested in the sentence that you wrote for the introduction to this project. So we all have this very thoughtful piece to start with, written beautifully by Priya. So it says, the pandemic has evoked or intensified a profound questioning around ideas of space, movement, shelter, security around what is private or public, individual or collective, national or planetary. I think that opens up a lot of questions around room, the function of room, the limits of room. And I'm interested in this division and the blurring boundaries between the private and the public. And I agree with you, Priya, that the pandemic heightened the questioning around that. But I think the line between the two has always been shaky. So whenever I think about rooms or room, especially the bedroom, I always think about how the public and the political are present in the private space, so they can shape and invade the private. So the room can be an intimate space where you witness larger ideas, larger aspirations, larger ideologies coming and going, and they shape the individuals occupying the room. And I'm also interested in the connection between the room and the self. Often in the bedroom, we have a mirror. The place or the mirror as an arena where the self is invented and reinvented. And what's interesting is that in the process of projecting the idea of the self in the mirror, in the room, that process cannot be separated from the larger structures, patriarchal structures, neoliberal structures, and in the context of my story, religion. And class is, of course, very much part of it. So what I've just mentioned here, the idea of the private self, I think it's of course a very bourgeois idea about the room, because often the room is just a place to sleep before one engages in long hours of low-paid, underpaid work. And often in a less privileged family in the global south, there is no separation between members of the same household. There is no private space because there are no rooms. So yeah, I'm interested in exploring that always shaky distinction between the public and the private through room.
Thank you, Intan. That was such an amazing arc you made from acknowledging where you are. And I think in that acknowledgement, it speaks so much to what a lot of your work deals with, which is history and knowing, you know, the implications of history in the now, and being willing also to recognize and acknowledge that, however painful it is. So the fact of Australia as a settler colonial project nation, and then coming to the bedroom, which we'll hear more about later, which you wrote about, sort of like this tremendous spectrum that room holds. You sort of described it there for us so strongly. Thank you. Billy Ray, would you like to reflect on room?
Mm-hmm. Well, firstly, thank you, Priya, for gathering us here. It's such, it feels like a really auspicious occasion, and I feel fortunate to be a part of it. I am zooming in from Vancouver, British Columbia in Canada. Vancouver's unlawfully, in a way, situated on the ancestral and unceded lands of the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh people. And I am from the Driftpal Cree Nation, which is an Indigenous community in what is now called Northern Alberta, in territory governed by Treaty 8, which was meant to operate as a kind of ethical accord between Indigenous people, the Cree in particular, and those who arrived on the shores of what is now called Canada. Anyone who knows anything about the history of North America knows that that ethical accord was not taken up by the colonizers. And much brutality unfolded throughout the long 20th century and continues to in various ways. So when I was prompted to think about room and space, I thought of a single room, an actual literal room in a house that my mom moved into this year, which in my essay poem, I note that it is the house where nuns who likely administered the residential school that our kin were made to attend lived in. And so for those who don't know, the Indian residential school era was a long, incredibly evil undertaking in which Indigenous children were kidnapped from their families, from their nations, in order to be cultivated as subjects of empire. And these schools were administered by various religious leaders, not just the Catholic, but also others. And this room in this house, so the center of the house being unrenovated, existing as it did when it was first built, created this arc from the past to the present with which I could situate my family's history in a larger narrative of nation. To reveal both, of course, the ongoingness of the colonial project, but more importantly, the impossibility of total conquest. And in minor and major ways, Indigenous people in Canada have improvised freedom under intense conditions of duress. And one of those ways is through joy. Joy is a preoccupation of mine because it rears its head even where state power is incredibly concentrated. And I always say that to desire joy is itself a kind of enactment of freedom, that freedom is an incredibly joyous desire. And so the essay poem concludes on this note that I hope registers as joyous and shows that despite the history of the long 20th century, that we Indigenous people in the present are not just non-beings in the badlands of modernity, but that we are building other worlds for different futures.
Yeah, I love that in your essay as well, that on the one hand, this acknowledgement of, the absolute brutality and reach of the colonial system, and at the same time, the fact that it wasn't complete, it didn't destroy everything, however much it destroyed. Mm. And there's in your essay, in your book of essays, you also, this idea of joy comes up again, and the way you insist on the way that your people continue to gather on the side of life, as you put it. And also what you said, I want to be for life and to be against that which is against life. And it's really fascinating for me that the way in the midst of also writing about how much has been destroyed and damaged, there are always these this insistence also on what persists and endures and recreates and reinvigorates. So yeah, thank you, Billy Ray.
Yeah, thank you.
Adeniya, would you like to add something to Room from your perspective?
I mean, hearing what Intan shared and Billy Ray, because it also leads me somehow to think about Room while almost in a dialogue of what they brought in. And I think, I mean, in an experience of incarceration, that is something I've been thinking actually a lot about in the last few months about, for instance, Palestinian prisoners and the act of imprisonment as well, that is being essentially reliant on a room. And this is like the kind of room that is always will be there and it will not be destroyed in the Palestinian context, whereas all other rooms of your choice will be destroyed. So it's a very shaky, you have this kind of desire and hatred towards them at the same time. And almost a wish that will never materialize itself because you want it, but the only possibility for it is one that is against exactly this desire of freedom that Billy Ray was speaking about, where your desire was for something, as if the room turns your desire against yourself, where you're seeking freedom, which does not necessarily relate not to being in a room, but suddenly the room has its meaning that it's an anti-freedom somehow, in the case, for instance, prisoners. But then I personally confess that I always was finding rooms something very precious, something very meaningful, but also something that is frightening and creates lots of conflicting desires. This moment of approaching something, but you don't know the minute that you enter it, what it will create further. It's no longer the room that you think is there, that you're giving it its own meaning, but probably it's almost like a trap. The minute that you enter it, it might have a complete different meaning. And how it is seen also from the inside and the outside. I mean, I don't know, sometimes we might get inside the room and other things, we're excluding them, whereas all what we seek is intimacy and a different relation. And I think maybe literature is the only place where suddenly almost the room sort of neutralizes that. It takes it to something that is not as painful as and conflicting and unclear. And here I recall kind of in a different way what you also brought in the introduction on Virginia Woolf, how it's important to have a room. And I think through writing, it's not that we need the room to write, but I think through that writing, the room has also a different meaning. And it's almost like looking for a place in this world, one that one feels safe, but we are rarely feeling safe. So it's almost this kind of wish that it never happens, but maybe through writing, the act of writing makes it happen. And I can see that in all the texts that we shared. There's almost all these texts, they gather together this many steps of our emotions towards this space, and it's not neutral. We are always faced by so many rooms. The whole day we move from one to another, outside rooms, inside rooms, and almost like it's there. And I think they witness so many different emotions as well, and they almost design also certain emotions. So thank you for bringing this theme. It's almost like thinking of something we always are so close to, but suddenly we need to think about, like, okay, to look at it.
Billy, Ray, Intan, would you like to pick up on anything before we move on?
Yeah, I think I agree with a lot of what Billy Ray and Adania mentioned. I really like that idea of like the tension between what Adania mentioned, the tension between finding a safe place for us, but we know that that's probably almost an impossible project. But we, I think I think desire is important. Like joy is is important. Like what Billy Ray mentioned, and it's really interesting how I touch a little bit on. What Billy Ray also wrote in his text about the reserve as an enabling space. So there are rooms, there are spaces like reserves, prison, ghetto. They are all spaces that are created to enable a larger structure, enable settler colonialism, and enable capitalism. But at the same time, you also find resistance within these spaces, and I think it's good to have hope. Yeah, that's just for me.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned hope, because Besufekat in the piece that we have in the anthology also describes how this writing was a way to keep hope going in these very fraught circumstances of this army encroaching on the capital in Ethiopia. And Besufekat also sent some reflections which echo a bit with what you were saying, Adenia, about this ambiguity of room as something that can be a place of protection and yet one of enclosure or containment or confinement, like the prison that you described. And Besufekat describes this ambivalence. She says to me, room seemed to me both necessity but prone to abuse. And Besufekat also mentions this, both the room as a space in which one has a certain kind of freedom and also gated community, securitized spaces. And I think this tension, these very different ways in which spaces that are safe for some are often so at the expense of others, and that we live often with that awareness and that tension. And I just want to also share what Besu said in relation to the text. And this is quoting directly. I approach room in the text as a model for the 11 ethnic regions there are in Ethiopia. While it may have been necessary to mark those rooms following the natural differences that exist in culture and language between our provinces, they have no doubt served, in brackets, been abused as ethnic cards to be used by people with power for things that are self-serving, in the process overshadowing the beauty in the cultures and languages that naturally mark borders of rooms. And reading that, I thought about how division or separation is not necessarily always a bad thing in itself, but it's to what end, who is exploited, and who has power and privilege at cost to whom. And I think all of you in your essays, stories, reflections, this question of power plays quite a role. And even in the most intimate stories, so in the bedroom that Intan writes about, the mother's bedroom, and Adeniya in the story of this community in these close-knit houses, taking up space is also a way of sort of asserting power, and who gets to do that. I think this might be a good moment to hear something of the different texts and then talk further from there, because you've all said a bit about the writing, and I think it'll be really nice for the listeners to get a little taster of your texts. Would you like to begin, Intan?
Yeah, thank you, Priya. So I'm going to read just a paragraph from my story. I'm going to read in two languages, in Bahasa Indonesia and in English. So just to give a background, in this story, I talk about mother-daughter relationship. The mother is ill, immobilized in her bed at home, and she is taken care of by her husband and her eldest daughter. This is the relationship between her and her eldest daughter. And the mother asks for her patient bed to be moved from the bedroom to the family room. So it's like being the center of everything. The mother loses control over her body. So the only thing that she can do is to make others feel what she feels: boredom, repetition, imprisonment. And the story is told from the perspective of the eldest daughter. Ibuku berkeras, maka disinilah ia terbaring menatap langit-langit sambil mendengarkan suara televisi. Bila suster sibuk menyiapkan makanan, aku akan duduk di samping ibuku dan mengerjakan tugas kantor, dengan komputer di pangkuan hingga pahaku panas. Mama akan mengomentari berita di televisi. Setelah itu disuruhnya aku mencari kanal lain untuk menonton sinetron. Lalu tak lama kemudian ia minta berita lagi. Lalu sinetron, berita, sinetron. Lalu ia mengumpat dasar sinetron norak sebelum akhirnya menyuruhku mematikan televisi. Setiap kali ia tertidur, aku merasa lega. Kupandangi matanya yang terkatup dan bibirnya yang kering terbuka setengah. Lalu aku kembali pada layar komputerku. Sebentar saja, sebab 10 menit kemudian ia akan membuka matanya lagi dan memintaku membaca Al-Quran. Aku membaca sembarang surat dan ia terpejam. Setelah 15 menit biasanya ia bosan mendengarkan suaraku. Ia akan memintaku memutar rekaman pembacaan ayat kursi di YouTube. Volume terlalu kecil sehingga aku harus membesarkannya. Namun, tak lama kemudian, ibuku minta volume dikecilkan, besarkan, kecilkan, besarkan, matikan. Semua mati, katanya. Cuma aku yang belum mati. Okay, and this is the English translation, beautifully translated by Stephen J. Epstein. My mother insisted, so she'd lie there staring at the ceiling and listening to the television. When the nurse prepared food, I'd sit beside my mother and work with a computer perched on my lap until my thighs grew hot. Mama would comment on the news on television and then tell me to find a channel with a soap opera. But soon she'd ask for more news, soap, news, soap. Then she'd curse, damn techie soap operas, before finally telling me to turn the TV off. I felt relieved whenever she fell asleep. I'd look at her closed eyes and her dried lips, half open, and return to my computer screen for just a few moments, because 10 minutes later, she'd open her eyes again and ask me to read from the Quran. I'd choose a verse at random and her eyes would close. After 15 minutes, she'd tire of my voice and have me find a reading of the Ayat al-Kursi on YouTube. The volume would be too low, so I'd need to turn it up. But before long, Mama would ask me to turn it down, up, off. Everything is dead, she'd say. But I'm not dead yet. Thank you.
Thank you. It was wonderful to hear the Indonesian. Bidiri, Adenia, is there anything you wanted to say with respect to Intan's text before we move on? I just wouldn't like to lose the moment.
So you mentioned that is a chapter from a larger work. And I was just curious if there was anything you wanted to say about where this chapter fits. I mean, you don't have to, of course, but
thank you, Billy Ray. I forgot about that. I should mention that. It's a chapter from a novel in progress. So I'm working on that novel about this. Okay, how to mention it without giving too much. Like, it's about three sisters, and it's also a reflection on mostly women, religion, but also within this changing landscape in Indonesia with Islamic resurgence, the mainstreaming of Islam in public spaces, but also, as you can see from my novel, the family is really shaped by this idea of neoliberal, aspiring middle class family, and they are in a way sort of victimized or not affected by that, including the mother's disappointment and the feeling of failure. So thank you for reminding me that it's part of something larger, the novel that I'm working on. And thank you for LCB for providing me with the opportunity to share this.
Adenia, did you want to add anything, or should we go on with the reading?
Yeah, I just was maybe kind of saying that what struck me with Intan text is how this bedroom is kind of almost like pain is locked in there and can never leave. And we never have access to that pain. It's really, it gave me at this moment this almost perspective of not being in a room, but outside the room, and how all that is can be there. And I found really this is it's almost a room that it's not excluding others, but it is excluded from the world. So yeah,
thank you for the feedback, Adania. I mean, that feeling of you think that you can talk about the room, you can describe the room, but it's also inaccessible. Thank you.
Billy Ray, would you like to read a section from your essay poem now?
Yes.
Please? Thank you.
It's called A Man Isn't a Country. What is a reserve? An effective opening to the world, a place that makes everywhere else in a settler state possible. What does that make me? A child birthed from the ditch of history. A simple explanation. The earth isn't round, it is in the shape of a broken heart. Scrolling absent-mindedly through Twitter one morning, I came across a letter dated July 24th, 1935, from the office of the Indian agent at Driftpile, Alberta. Indian agents were government henchmen who enforced the Indian Act, a piece of legislation that, for example, forbade the practice of ceremony and the use of indigenous languages. For decades, it also limited the movement of indigenous peoples. During this era, reserves were, in effect, open-air prisons. When you live in an open-air prison, even the wind feels like a slap from God. The mind is an absent ruler. It is a shape I try to fill in. Most days, I am as hungry as a shoreline. The lake is my ancestor, even if it will outlast me. I believe in the sovereignty of water in northern Alberta. That is, I am serious about my indeterminacy. Thank you.
Thank you, Billy Ray. I love that I'm serious about my indeterminacy. I feel like that's a word that is also so, that indeterminacy, so apt for the way all of you thought and write in this kind of zone of uncertainty of something provisional. Intan, Adeniya, any thoughts, responses, anything you would like to say in response to Billy Ray's piece?
Yeah, I really love it. I think I would just like to restate what I mentioned earlier about a place that makes everywhere else in a settler state possible. You know, again, going back to the idea of a space as an enabling space for something else, something that is not protecting the individuals, the groups in that particular space. Also, I really love how the past, the present, and the future are merging together here. We get the banal act of scrolling through Twitter, and then what happened in the past, the violence that happened in the past. But also, I find that this idea of, this one sentence I really love: "The lake is my ancestor, even if it will outlast me." So you get a sense of the future and how big the future is, and how it transcends the past and the present. So yeah, I really like this reflection of settler colonialism and hope and somewhat resistance.
And it's very interesting what you're saying, Intan, about even time, because I think, with Billy Ray's piece, it's almost, I know there is an attempt to pin things in past and present and future, which is also like this kind of a certain enforcement of history or narrative, which comes with colonialism as well. And really like what you were saying before about hope and how we can almost cultivate hope. Was it you or Biso in our discussion? And I think really it's even this kind of, I think in all these writings, like we almost free ourselves from this burden of time, like even maybe finding a way that is beyond time. And the sentence where you quote from Billy Ray, it's no longer this place and time, but almost like, okay, we're gonna move within everything freely, despite one trying to restrict you to a territory, to a zone, to enclose you, to tell you your past is lost and your present is meaningless and your future is not something to look forward. But then you just say, no, actually, I'm not gonna think along these terms. And I think really this was my feeling with Billy Ray. Like it's there and away from this linear time. And it's really, like also mentioning, because when you were reading your piece, Billy Ray, I remember today I was reading a text by a young Palestinian prisoner, and I think this is what also I brought the question of prisoners. And so he was commissioned to write a text while he's in prison. And it's amazing, like how writing becomes, like the prison becomes almost a playground of where he's running from one idea in this corner to the time when they need to work. And really, like that was the first time I also could see that he's relating to the prison, or he turned the prison in a space of weirdly to say that, I hope I'm not getting it really wrong, but almost a place of freedom, a freedom of that is you can not be confined to what it wants to confine you to. I don't know, maybe writing is like so so transformative that it can do that. And I wonder also how writing for you has been. I don't dare to ask this, but I would love to hear more from you about the sense of confinement and how writing emerged within that. If you can speak more about this, Billy Ray.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. I've written before about how this particular paradox in which many of those who live on reserves still exist. Many who live there don't have an awareness of the sick experiment that reserves were. Their beginning as open air prisons, and that of course reveals one of the machinations of coloniality, which is to withhold a knowledge from or withhold particular kinds of knowledge from particular kinds of people. But I think it also subtly gestures again to the ways that confinement or imprisonment never fully eradicate people's ability to resist and invent kinds of knowledge and ways of being in the world. And how I've thought of my job as a writer who emerges from that history and whose entire family essentially lives on the reserve and around on this lake, that really is this lake is has been witness to so much, both our pre-colonial history and then the colonial history. My job, I think, is to render visible those logics that without the critical faculties, whole hosts of people might not acquire the language for, but nonetheless very much feel the brunt of those logics in their daily lives.
I wonder if you could also speak a bit, Billy Ray, to the question of form and how what you're describing also then influence this way that you write, which is a sort of hybrid between forms, fragmentary, and yet very much, of course, whole in itself, and how you arrived at that, or how it connects.
Mm-hmm. So my third book, A History of My Brief Body, is written primarily in fragments. I think that emerged because I had been living a fragmented life. I couldn't see a arc for my life. What did thread it together from the point of view of my early 20-something self was suffering, but also the desire for freedom. And so I organized my thinking and my writing around those two nodes or coordinates. And similar, I think, with this essay, I wasn't up for the task of and there wasn't enough space for it or time to do a meticulous tracing of this history from the Indian Act of 1867 to the the residential school era to the present. The forum wasn't capacious enough for that, so I thought, why don't I focus less on the facts, historical minutia, and more so on emotional truth. And the fragment, I think, is lends itself to the articulation of emotional truth.
That makes me think of something that has come up a lot in Adenia in your writing, when the suspicion of the kind of glossy, smooth story and the interest in the kind of stuttering, stumbling narration that really acknowledges not just the existence of gaps and erasures, but their value because they are evidence of other realities that have been destroyed or forgotten or just overlooked and not valued. And so, I think, I don't know if you wanted to add something there, Adenia. It just struck me that there's also in that a kind of bridge.
Yeah, I mean, I totally share what Billy Ray said about the fragmentation and basically, yes, it is. It's not even the emotional truth only, but even it's the linguistic truth sometimes, in a certain because it's not that, it's silence in these situations. It has so many lives and presences. There's this the silence that is being enforced. And then when we take up silence as something very essential in our craft, in our, in how we approach writing, it's also a question how these two silences can live and acknowledge each other. Where the writing is also equally written by silence or by silencing. Actually, yeah, I mean, it's really, it's hard to write silence if it ever wants to be written or can be written. And I think the fragmentary structure is the choice of that, because anything about something that's structured and going into this linear narrative that moves in a certain way is a complete a perfection that only a lie can make so perfect. The truth is so much scarred and broken and articulate and fragmented and not, in these kind of situations, which words you would trust. And I think what Billy Ray was saying, to find a language, even sometimes I think this is almost an impossibility, where one writes with these silences and with these gaps as part of literature. It's so funny today. I also I was jumping between texts today, and there is this story, a very funny story, just moving away from our very grim realities and past and probably futures. So there's the 3 Swiss writers there joined together in a room. So it's Böcklin and his son and Keller, and they always sit like writers like to sit in silence. They don't say anything for hours, and suddenly the young Böcklin says, "It's hot," and then silence comes back. And after 15 minutes, the old Brooklyn says, and there's no wind. And then silence goes back. And after a while, Keller stands and says, I won't drink with chatterboxes, and leaves. And it's amazing, like, you know, it's almost like this insistence and not being afraid of silence. And I think sometimes writing is a place really where it's not afraid of silences. And sometimes if you say a bit too much, a bit unnecessary, it becomes you're really a chatterbox, like Keller, he says here correctly.
Intan, I wondered if you would like to add anything here, because your text is also one of things that have not been spoken or acknowledged in this relationship of the mother and the daughter, and the things that can't be said but which are so blatantly there. And you're also, you know, treading this ground of how to articulate or not articulate.
Thank you. And I'm interested in what Adenia mentioned about silence and gaps. And I completely agree. This is really, like, writing is really the place to explore and celebrate that. And, you know, just in daily life, I feel like writers, because most of us are introverts, we are quite afraid of, you know, awkward silences. And I feel that writing is the place where we can be ourselves in that sense. I mean, in my, I can also see the cracks, the gaps in Billy Ray's piece, which I find really beautiful, and that's the area that I'm exploring as well. So you can get a sense of the room, the mother. You get from the eldest daughter's description of the room, you have stories of the mother from different periods, from the 80s, where the mother looked like someone coming out of a woman's magazine, like a career woman trying to have a control of her life within this neoliberal idea of success. And she tried to mold the daughter based on based on this idea, and of course that didn't really go according to the plan. And then throughout history, we have different stories of the mother, where the mother gets more and more broken, and then finally she sees religion as shelter. But we are not really sure, is she being more religious, or is it something else? And then I'm always interested in what is not said, and what appears on the surface, but there's always something lurking beneath. I think those gaps, the invisible, the understated, I find that these are the most interesting things in literature, and the theme, the room as a theme allows me to explore this dimension.
Of course, we have a gap in our constellation, a silence tonight, since Besufakad is not with us, but at least we have the text. And I would love to share a section with all of you now, which I have the pleasure to read on Besu's behalf. It's from this text called Motives Under Motifs. And I think all the things that you have been talking about here, about how to deal with, how to write under the pressure of what can be said and can't be said, particularly in a politically charged context, really come to play in this text. The text is made of 11 sections, as was clear from the introduction that was shared. And I'm just going to read parts 8, 9, and 10. 8. They said the people said nothing when the government closed services. You had no money with which to buy the food that now cost fivefold more because the banks were closed. The children had to be told schools were closed. And you suffered watching people in sickness that the health centers couldn't help with because their supplies were dry. But you and I know why the people didn't say anything. It's because our leaders have for centuries not allowed their people to think differently from them. They made parrots of our wise people. And have those that thought differently had a choice but to do it at the risk of death? And you remember, it was the authorities who carried your name who refreshed the culture of teaching people to fear to think. They made thinking dangerous, even while they named themselves thinkers and fighters for freedom to think. 9. We also said nothing when soldiers from a neighboring land came to ours and did what they did. Tell me how bad it was, Hawe. Cry those hot tears, so few as if you do not deserve the full outpouring of today's kids who cry more over a football game lost. At first, I didn't believe it because I didn't want to, and because liars were everywhere. But it's true, isn't it? They really did put sharp objects in women's bodies, forced women in front of their children. And did they shoot children in front of their mothers? When I heard it, I took out my handkerchief and let the tears free. I prayed that some of your agony was divided to me so that it was a little easier for you. But it was unbearable, wasn't it? Why didn't I speak out? This one was not a holy silence, nor am I a parrot. It was the silence of the normally hopeless who suddenly saw some hope, but then lost it. 10. You and I love this land because colonization came, shameless, here too. The land had people who had a strong sense of that shamefulness, many people, enough to mobilize from all corners and win a battle with an invading power from afar, manyfold stronger than them. We name our land for the God that has been worshipped since before that religion by its oldest church. And we love the land because people there are each other's, although they also keep to their own. We love the land because it has capacities with which to stop the scourges of this world. But I don't know how much of this is still there and how much of it in our imagination. Because today, where is what we love about the land, Hawe? It's hard to talk about this without our colleague with us, but it's also very precious to have the words when the presence is not there. And I would just like to invite the three of you to share any thoughts, questions, reflections in response to the encounter we were very fortunate to have with Besu.
I can start. I think I'm just so struck by that, the last line of number 9, the silence of the normally hopeless who suddenly saw hope but then lost it. It just feels like such a capacious description of the lives of so many, not just in Ethiopia but elsewhere. But to think with the context of the essay, And to further pull along our thread about silence, I was going to remark as well how we all four of us are interested in silence. The way that like silence is fertile ground for revolution and for resistance. And how it's something, silence is also under attack, and invasion, colonization, these things very much take as one of their targets both collective and individual silence. And I thought that was that was so powerfully articulated here.
Yeah, can I follow up on that? Yeah, I agree with you, Billy Ray. I also find the last sentences of part 9, section 9, I find those very powerful, especially this one. This one was not a holy silence, nor am I a parrot. So I think it's really important to interrogate ourselves and our position, our silence, because whenever we talk about political issues, there's an expectation that we should speak up, and there's sometimes speaking up already means that you do something, and I think to some extent it might lead to self-righteousness, and I think that's what Basil here wants us to be more mindful about, to be more critical about. Speaking up is not necessarily doing something, and then being not being able to speak up also reveals a lot of complexities, and this is the complexity that she underlines, the inability to directly speak up because you are just too overwhelmed, you are just too confused, you are too angry, right? You are too angry and you cannot speak up immediately. And I really like this reflexive reflexive gesture in the reading. I find it really against the whole idea of self-righteousness. You have to speak up, you have to represent an issue. I think it's more about questioning where you are and your capacity and your inability as well. So I love the complexity that Basil presents here.
Adenia, is there anything you would like to add at this point before we go into a final reading?
Yeah, I mean, I think what the text of Basil brings in is also the pain is also in the foreground without being articulated as well. Because all this, you are not hopeless, you are turned into hopeless, and this is an act of violence. And I think I see it in a way, it's for me, it's not about speaking up, because you never want to represent something, and it's not about you trying to convince others of your pain. And I think what this text is doing is not talking about pain, but it is written from pain, and a pain that has been inflicted. And I think this is exactly writing, but not speaking up. And I think this is really the big difference, because it's also kind of often this representation or trying to convince others of your pain. It is already kind of doubling the violence on you, and this text is not allowing it. her text is really is almost, as we were speaking earlier, is an invitation, a gentle kind of invitation, a tender invitation to come into the mind as the room, or the self as the room that is experiencing this pain at this specific moment. And I think this very specific moment is something that is escaping what it's depicting, how it is escaping writing. It's almost writing how it's not possible to write about pain, but from pain. Yeah, it's
there's, I mean, also the risk, I think, of writing is brought so close to us because of these circumstances, and that Besu can't be with us, and yet the need to do it, and to share, and therefore to give us a chance also to get closer to a reality that is not just there is in many places, but in this very particular expression of possibility of oppression and censorship. And we are coming close to running out of time, and we still have one more text that we would love to hear a bit from. And so Adeniya, I would invite you to please read from the original Arabic, and then I will have the pleasure of reading the English translation.
Yeah, thank you, Priya, for agreeing to read the English, because I feel like if I do both, I'm betraying seriously the Arabic. I can only be with one at a time. إمكيبورغ تسكن على يساري، وقبالتي يسكن أوهان. تفصل بيننا ساحة يخرج منها ممر يقود إلى مؤخرة الحوش، إلى بيت سالبي وبيت كيران، وبينهما بيت الأستاذ. في حين أمام أبواب هؤلاء الثلاثة يوجد ممر آخر لا يزيد عرضه عن 1.5 متر، والذي كان في السابق ساحة، قبل أن تقوم سالبي بإضافة غرفة على البيت وتلحظ بعض الأمتار منها. وكيران لم تكن لتتحمل ذلك، لم تعد تستطيع. هي أولاً مريضة بالأزمة، والغبر التي أثارتها عملية البناء تلك قتلتها تماماً. زد على ذلك أن الممر إلى بيتها صار ضيقاً جداً وخانق. أما سالبي التي كانت حامل، صحيح بدون تخطيط، ولكنها لن تجهض، بدت بحاجة لغرفة ولو صغيرة لمولودها الجديد الثالث. فانبثق شجار عظيم بين الجارتين فقد خلاله زوج سالبي أعصابه وضرب شقيق كيران، وكانت تلك النهاية، ذلك فوق الحد. ولقد مضى أكثر من عام ونصف دون أن تتحدث الواحدة مع الثانية. عندما يفتح باب إحداهما يغلق باب الأخرى بهدوء. Thank you.
Thank you, Adenia. That sounded so beautiful. And thank you so much to Adam Talib, who translated into English, so that those of us who are not fortunate enough to know Arabic can still enjoy Adeniya's story and Extra Room. Kevork lives to my left, while across from me lives Ohan. There's a courtyard that separates us, with an alleyway that leads to Salpi's and Karan's houses at the other end, squashing the professor's house between them. In front of these 3 houses, there is another alleyway, no wider than 1.5 meters across. It was once a courtyard too, before Salpi decided to add an extra room onto her house and eat up a few meters of that courtyard. Karan, though, could not take it. She was no longer able to do so. First of all, she was asthmatic, and the dust that was thrown up by all the construction was really killing her. That was in addition to the fact that the path to her house got much narrower and cramped. But Salpi, who was pregnant, True, it wasn't planned, yet she wasn't going to abort it. Needed an extra room, even a small one, for her third child to be. And a huge fight broke out between the two neighbors, during which Salpi's husband lost his temper and punched Karan's brother. And that was the end. Things had gone far beyond limits. A year and a half had passed without the two neighbors speaking to each other. When one opened her door, the other closed hers discreetly.
Thank you, Priya.
Billy Ray, Intan, your thoughts, reactions, any questions to Adeniya on the story?
I can remark that I think there's this beautiful thing happening here where the story is microscopic in that it's, you know, zooming in on this neighborhood or this sort of tenement, but it's so alive and holds so much life and a multitude of lives and voices. And I agree with a remark that our colleague said before we met, that the story does indeed feel so complete and effortless and real. And I also thought there was something here really compelling about the ways that people, again, you know, paradoxically or with contradiction, are so close to one another, but at the same time that there's a kind of a barrier to the forms of closeness that might enable us to, you know, connect with one another more deeply.
Would you like to pick up, Intan?
Yes, I love this a lot. I feel that the story is, in a way, it reminds me of a neighborhood many neighborhoods in Indonesia, very lively neighborhoods, which I don't really find in Western countries. Lively, not in a sense that the story itself is deceiving. It seems lively, but it's also and humorous, but it's also subtle, and there's so much to excavate, so many things beneath what is seen. So in this closely knitted neighborhood, we see the politics of the space. As you mentioned earlier, Priya, this is about people taking up the space, and people who are entitled to take up more space, public space actually, from others. What I really love here is how you see, yes, this is taught from the story, from the point of view of but we see an ensemble of characters, which I often see in Indonesian stories. In closely knitted neighborhood, you get the chance to introduce different characters, and they live so closely to each other, and people are gossiping about each other. I feel like there's a cultural closeness there, but at the same time, these people also don't know a lot about about their neighbors. They don't know a lot, for instance, about the professor, and while they are busy taking up space from each other, and they are concerned. And also, what's interesting is that a lot of the concerns, issues that people are concerned of, seem to be trivial, but from what seems to be trivial, there's more more serious issues. I find that I agree with Basil. We had a chat with Basil before the event, and she mentioned that this is an effortless piece. I feel like I love just how the storyteller tells the story. It's not just about the storyteller. It's about the cast of characters as well, in the neighborhood. Yeah, that's for me.
Yeah, I only can echo what you said. What I found so fascinating was the way in which people put up walls, even in this very close-knit and close living space, just with their gestures, the looking away, the not hearing, and then the cost of that, because the professor, who is somehow not taken in as he might wish to be, even though people have kept him at a distance, when he's not there, suddenly this community doesn't quite cohere in the same way. And it was very fascinating to me, Adenia, this idea of the outsider who comes in, is kept at a distance, and yet is somehow the glue almost for how all the others relate. And this sort of painful, kind of tragic contradiction in the whole story was really heartbreaking. And yeah, I wondered if you might say a bit about that, these walls that are put up and then stay, because even with the person gone, there's this kind of absence, this gap then that can never be filled.
Yeah, maybe for me, if I approach the text as a reader of it, it's like how this character that nobody cared about or cares about can also be the center of their life. It's like how is the most unimportant presence naturally can also become the excuse to maintain distance and to show this insistence despite the spatial closeness on being distant and kind of almost scapegoating, or just by turning the face. Sometimes it's like, there is maybe a wall or a room that is being built, but sometimes it's just enough to do things quietly, to run away, to hide, and it's how to hide within this place, but where the sounds are also playing. They bring things and unintentional and peeping and seeing. It's almost everything that is being done is done without the permission of others in this text. Like nobody accepts anything. Nobody is happy to speak to anybody. All conversations are being enforced. Like nothing is natural. And when they pretend they are nice, actually they are confessing they are not nice. But they live. This is how they live. It's and they maintain. There's even still warmth within that. This inability to almost the inability to live happily.
Yeah, these strange social forms that we either are forced into or adopt or adapt to in order to rub along somehow, even if it's not a happy kind of result, as you said, Adeniya. We have also touched on many dark things in the course of the last hour and a half. And nevertheless, I feel like a deep gratitude and happiness to have shared this time with all of you. And I thank you so much for your presence, your text. Thanks also to Besu Fekad for being with us in spirit and in other ways. I think I leave this encounter of ours with just a different appreciation for silences. Every time we met online as well, there were these silences. And I was so happy when Adenia said, because as the host, you sometimes feel as though you have to fill them in, or I don't know, that it's, as you mentioned, Intan, that this awkwardness of the silence. And Adenia sort of really gave me a kind of key at the end of one of our last meetings when she said, you know, and our silences, they also have like a role to play in our meetings and our encounters. And that's been confirmed in I think a really, I don't know, in a relaxed way for me. And that's a very nice thing. So my deep gratitude to you all again for being part of this project, for making it so special, and for so generously giving to all of us.
And thank you for also bringing us together where we didn't have to speak, actually, and we were not chatterboxes, as Kela would complain. Thank you all. It felt like we were together, but calmly, and we have this presence over. We knew about each other. We know that we are together, but without physically being actually together, it's almost like spirits. We shared this space. So thank you for bringing us. Thank you for Lara and the LCB and everybody.
Yeah, thank you so much for facilitating this virtual community. I do feel that this is a community filled with awkward silences. But it's a pleasure. Thank you so much, Priya and Lara and LCB.
Yes, I'll just echo everything that the other panelists have said. Thank you.
Good night, everyone. Thank you for being with us and for joining us and sharing this room that we were all able to make together for a brief amount of time. Bye-bye.